On December 15, 1984, two brothers at England's most exclusive boarding school went to bed in their dormitory and simply vanished by morning. 12-year-old James and 10-year-old Michael Hartwell left behind only empty beds and a mystery that would haunt their family for 36 years. But what activists discovered in 2020 about their disappearance would expose a conspiracy so dark it challenged everything the public believed about Britain's elite educational institutions. This isn't just a story about missing children. It's about a systematic program of abuse and experimentation that operated with impunity for decades, protected by wealth, privilege, and government complicity. James and Michael Hartwell were not typical students at Blackwood Academy, England's most prestigious boarding school. While their classmates came from aristocratic families with centuries of wealth, the Hartwell boys were there on academic merit scholarships, their working-class parents having sacrificed everything to give their sons the best possible education. Robert Hartwell was a factory manager who had worked double shifts for years to save money for his son's education. Margaret Hartwell, a primary school teacher, believed that Blackwood Academy would open doors for James and Michael that she and her husband could never access themselves. Together, they had sold their family home and moved into a cramped flat, using every penny to afford the school fees that weren't covered by scholarships. James, the older brother at 12, was brilliant academically, but struggled with the social dynamics of elite education. He was protective of his younger brother Michael, who was artistic and sensitive, often overwhelmed by the harsh discipline and emotional coldness that Blackwood called character building. Despite their academic success, both boys seemed different when they came home for holidays. They were quieter, more withdrawn, and often appeared anxious when it was time to return to school. Margaret noticed that Michael had developed a nervous stutter and that James had lost weight. But when she questioned them, they insisted everything was fine. "Are you sure you're happy at Blackwood?" Margaret asked during their final dinner together before returning to school after Christmas break in 1984. "You both seem so quiet when you come home." James, ever the protector, answered for both of them. "It's fine, Mum, just different from here. But Michael and I look out for each other." Michael nodded, though his eyes showed a fear that his brother's confidence couldn't quite mask. "Some of the teachers are scary," he admitted quietly, "but James makes it better." Robert's final words to his sons as he dropped them off at the imposing stone gates of Blackwood Academy would haunt him forever. "Remember, you're Hartwells. We stick together, we work hard, and we never give up." Founded in 1847, Blackwood Academy had educated generations of British royalty, politicians, and business leaders. The school's Gothic architecture and ancient traditions conveyed prestige and permanence, but behind its impressive facade lay a culture of absolute authority and unquestioning obedience. Annual fees at Blackwood were equivalent to over £50,000 in today's money, putting the school beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest families. The waiting list included desperate parents willing to pay any price to secure their children's admission to an institution that virtually guaranteed entry to Oxford or Cambridge. The school's motto, "Discipline creates excellence," was carved in Latin above the main entrance, and discipline at Blackwood was indeed absolute. Students rose at dawn, attended mandatory study sessions until late evening, and were forbidden from leaving the grounds without permission. Contact with families was strictly limited, with phone calls monitored and letters censored. Headmaster Sir Reginald Thornbury ruled Blackwood with iron authority, supported by a staff of masters who viewed physical and psychological punishment as essential tools for molding young minds. Parents who questioned the school's methods were reminded that Blackwood's success spoke for itself. 90% of graduates attended elite universities, and alumni included cabinet ministers, judges, and captains of industry. On the evening of December 15, 1984, James and Michael Hartwell attended mandatory study hall like every other student at Blackwood Academy. Multiple witnesses saw them at their assigned desks, working on Latin translations and mathematics problems. At 9:30 p.m., when lights out was announced, both boys were in their dormitory beds. But when the wake-up bell rang at 6 a.m. on December 16th, their beds were empty. There were no signs of struggle or disturbance in the dormitory. The boys' belongings remained undisturbed, including pocket money they kept hidden in their textbooks. Their uniforms hung neatly in their wardrobes, and their homework assignments lay half-finished on their desks. The school's initial response was measured and controlled. Headmaster Thornberry informed the staff that the Hartwell brothers had left the grounds without permission and that a search was underway. The school gates had been locked all night, and the security guard reported no unusual activity. Most mysteriously, the school's newly installed CCTV system had mysteriously malfunctioned during the exact hours when the boys disappeared, leaving no video record of their movements or those of anyone else on the grounds. Police were called at 8 a.m., but their investigation was limited by the school's insistence on maintaining discretion to protect Blackwood's reputation. The media was kept at bay through legal threats and the influence of powerful alumni who served as government ministers and newspaper proprietors. Margaret and Robert Hartwell arrived at the school by noon, frantic with worry and demanding answers. They were met by Thornberry and the school's legal counsel, who assured them that every effort was being made to locate their sons. "Boys sometimes run away from school," Thornberry explained with practiced calm, "particularly boys who aren't quite suited to our environment. I'm sure James and Michael will contact you when they've had time to think through their impulsive decision." But Margaret knew her sons. They would never run away without telling her, and they would never abandon each other. Something terrible had happened at Blackwood Academy, and the school's evasive responses only deepened her growing sense of dread. As days turned to weeks without any trace of the Hartwell brothers, it became clear that their disappearance was being treated as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a crime to be solved. Police interviews with staff and students yielded no useful information, and the investigation was quietly scaled back after less than a month. Official records listed the boys as missing persons, but no national appeals were made for information, and their case received minimal media coverage. The Hartwell family was told that ongoing investigations prevented them from sharing details publicly, effectively silencing their efforts to generate publicity that might help find their sons. Meanwhile, Blackwood Academy continued operating as if nothing had happened. The boys' dormitory beds were reassigned to new students, their personal belongings were packed away, and their names were quietly removed from school records. It was as if James and Michael Hartwell had never existed. For 36 years, the case remained officially unsolved, filed away in police archives, and forgotten by everyone except the family that refused to stop searching. Margaret and Robert spent their life savings on private investigators, followed countless false leads, and never stopped believing that their sons were still alive somewhere. But in 2020, a package arrived at the office of children's rights activist Jessica Morgan that would finally expose the truth about what happened to the Hartwell brothers and dozens of other children who had vanished from elite schools across Britain. What Jessica discovered would prove that some disappearances aren't about children running away. They're about children being silenced forever. Jessica Morgan had spent 15 years investigating institutional abuse as director of the Children's Truth Alliance. A former social worker who had seen too many cases of powerful institutions silencing vulnerable victims, Jessica had dedicated her life to ensuring that children's voices were finally heard. The anonymous package that arrived at her London office in March 2020 contained materials that would change everything she thought she knew about elite British education. Inside were a weathered diary, dozens of photographs, financial records, and a single note. The truth about Blackwood Academy. William Fletcher kept these for 40 years. He's dead now, but the children deserve justice. William Fletcher had worked as a groundskeeper at Blackwood Academy from 1960 to 2000, maintaining the extensive grounds and buildings that housed Britain's future leaders. But Fletcher's diary revealed that he had also been an unwitting witness to systematic abuse that spanned 4 decades. "I saw things that made me sick," Fletcher had written in careful handwriting. Those Hartwell boys weren't the first to disappear. There were others over the years. The school called it early withdrawal or family relocation, but I knew. I saw the fear in those children's eyes before they vanished. Fletcher's diary contained detailed entries about 47 students who had officially withdrawn from Blackwood between 1970 and 1990, but whose departures Fletcher described as suspicious. In many cases, he had seen these children displaying signs of physical abuse or extreme psychological distress in the days before their disappearance. The photographs in Fletcher's package were the most disturbing evidence yet. 23 black and white images showed children in what appeared to be a basement facility that didn't match any known areas of Blackwood Academy. The children, all wearing school uniforms, looked malnourished, frightened, and psychologically broken. Jessica immediately contacted Dr. Michael Torres, a digital forensics expert, to analyze the photographs for authenticity. "These images haven't been manipulated," Torres confirmed after extensive analysis. "The metadata confirms they were taken between December 1984 and February 1985. The basement location exists, and these children were definitely there." In 3 of the photographs, Jessica could clearly identify 2 boys who matched school records for James and Michael Hartwell. The images showed them weeks after their reported disappearance, alive but obviously traumatized, and confined in the mysterious underground facility. The basement shown in the photographs featured medical equipment, restraint devices, and observation windows that suggested systematic psychological experimentation rather than simple imprisonment. Adult figures appeared in several photos, but their faces were deliberately obscured or turned away from the camera. Working with Professor Janet Williams, a specialist in institutional abuse history, Jessica began investigating the broader pattern of missing students from elite British schools. What they discovered was a systematic cover-up spanning multiple institutions and decades. Blackwood Academy appears in historical records of complaints dating back to 1962, Professor Williams revealed. Multiple allegations were filed with authorities, but investigations were repeatedly blocked due to the school's prestigious reputation and influential alumni network. The research revealed that at least 8 elite schools across Britain had unusually high rates of student withdrawals during the same period when children were disappearing from Blackwood. In each case, wealthy families were told their children had been transferred to specialized facilities for behavioral or academic problems. But no records existed of these transfers. Financial records in Fletcher's package showed payments totaling over £2 million made to families whose children had withdrawn from various schools. These payments were accompanied by strict non-disclosure agreements that legally prevented families from discussing their children's disappearances. Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist specializing in institutional trauma, analyzed the photographs and Fletcher's written observations of the missing children's behavior before their disappearances. The children in these photos exhibit classic signs of systematic psychological abuse, Dr. Foster concluded. Learned helplessness, extreme compliance, dissociative behavior. This wasn't random violence. It was organized psychological conditioning designed to break their resistance and create complete obedience. The medical equipment visible in the basement photographs suggested that children were being subjected to experimental psychological treatments that were illegal and unethical even by 1980s standards. The presence of restraint devices and isolation chambers indicated that resistance was met with severe punishment. As Jessica's investigation deepened, she discovered disturbing connections between Blackwood Academy and government agencies. Building permits for renovations in the 1950s showed construction of underground therapeutic facilities funded by anonymous benefactors who were later identified as wealthy alumni and government officials. The basement complex had been officially designated as medical treatment rooms for troubled students, but the architectural plans showed a sophisticated facility designed for long-term confinement and experimentation. Local authorities had been instructed to minimize oversight of these facilities, and inspection reports were routinely classified or destroyed. Members of Parliament and government officials served on Blackwood's Board of Governors, creating a protective network that ensured complaints about missing students were either ignored or actively suppressed. Police reports were routinely classified as confidential and removed from public access. Jessica's investigation led her to contact families whose children had disappeared from elite schools during the 1970s and 1980s. What she found were parents who had spent decades searching for answers while being systematically stonewalled by institutions and authorities. Margaret Hartwell, now 73, had never stopped believing her sons were alive. "Every Christmas, I set places for James and Michael at our table," she told Jessica. "People think I'm mad, but a mother knows when her children are dead. Mine aren't dead. They're hidden." Patricia Stone, whose son David had disappeared from Blackwood in 1978, described a familiar pattern of deception. "The school told us he'd been transferred to Switzerland for specialized treatment," she said. "We were given an address, but when we visited, no one had heard of our son. We never saw him again." Similar stories emerged from other families, children who had supposedly been sent to exclusive facilities abroad, who had allegedly run away to join relatives in other countries, or who had simply withdrawn from school with no explanation beyond vague references to behavioral problems. When Jessica attempted to bring her evidence to police, she encountered immediate resistance from powerful legal forces. Blackwood Academy's Alumni Association hired a prestigious law firm that threatened defamation lawsuits against anyone making unsubstantiated allegations about the school. Newspapers that showed interest in the story received legal warnings about publishing defamatory content, and television producers were pressured to drop planned investigations. The evidence Jessica had gathered was declared inadmissible due to its unknown chain of custody, and former staff members refused to speak publicly, citing confidentiality agreements they had signed decades earlier. Most frustratingly, the statute of limitations had expired on most of the potential crimes Jessica had uncovered. Even if she could prove that children had been abused or murdered at Blackwood Academy, the legal system provided no avenue for prosecution after so many years. Just as Jessica's investigation seemed to be reaching a dead end, she received an anonymous letter that would change everything. The message was brief, but tantalizing. "The basement still exists. Some children never left. Meet me at midnight, Blackwood Gates. Trust no one in authority." The letter was signed simply David and included details about the school's security systems that suggested inside knowledge. Against the advice of colleagues who worried about her safety, Jessica decided to make the midnight meeting. What David told her during their clandestine encounter in the shadows of Blackwood's imposing gates would prove that the Hartwell brothers' disappearance was just the beginning of a horror that was still ongoing, and that powerful forces would kill to keep their secrets buried. David Morrison had worked as a maintenance supervisor at Blackwood Academy from 1980 to 2010, 30 years during which he had seen things that haunted his conscience. Meeting Jessica in the darkness outside the school gates, he looked nervously over his shoulder as he revealed the truth about Blackwood's continuing operations. "The basement never closed," David whispered urgently. "They just got better at hiding it. New students still disappear, just not as obviously. Now they call it therapeutic intervention and alternative placement programs, but it's the same horror with different names." According to David, Blackwood Academy had evolved its methods after the media attention surrounding the Hartwell brothers' disappearance. Instead of children simply vanishing overnight, The school now used sophisticated psychological manipulation to convince families that their children needed specialized treatment at exclusive facilities that didn't officially exist. 15 children have vanished since 2000, David revealed. Their families are told they're receiving intensive therapy for behavioral disorders, or that they've been accepted to prestigious overseas programs. The parents pay enormous fees and are given limited contact through monitored video calls with children who seem drugged and distant. The modern operation was far more sophisticated than its 1980s predecessor. Wealthy families actively sought out Blackwood's special programs for children they considered embarrassing or difficult to control. The school had become a clearinghouse for elite families who wanted their problem children to simply disappear. David's revelations exposed a vast network of facilities operating across Britain and continental Europe. Blackwood Academy served as the central hub, identifying suitable subjects and coordinating their transfer to partner facilities that specialized in long-term psychological conditioning. The network included 8 elite schools across the UK, all operating similar programs under the guise of therapeutic intervention. Children were moved between facilities to prevent detection, and their locations were deliberately obscured through complex legal structures involving shell companies and offshore trusts. They've perfected the art of making children disappear legally, David explained. Parents sign documents thinking they're authorizing medical treatment, but they're actually surrendering all parental rights to a network of facilities that don't officially exist. Financial records that David had secretly copied showed the staggering scale of the operation. The network generated over £50 million annually from special placement fees charged to wealthy families. Insurance companies were defrauded through fake medical necessity claims, and government contracts provided additional funding for troubled youth intervention programs. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond Britain's borders. David revealed that children were regularly transported to facilities in Switzerland, France, and Ireland, where different legal systems made detection and prosecution nearly impossible. These international facilities specialized in advanced psychological conditioning techniques that had been developed over decades of experimentation. Children who entered these programs emerged years later as completely different people, their original personalities and memories systematically erased and replaced. I've seen children go in as normal kids and come out as perfect, obedient servants, David said, his voice shaking with emotion. They remember their families, but they feel no emotional connection. It's like they've been turned into biological robots, programmed to serve whoever pays for their conditioning. The international network was protected by diplomatic immunity and government connections that reached the highest levels of European politics. Officials who had been educated at elite schools protected the system that had created them, ensuring that investigations were blocked and whistleblowers were silenced. Through David's contacts, Jessica was able to meet with Thomas, a man who claimed to have escaped from Blackwood's basement facility in 1987. Now in his 40s, Thomas had spent 30 years trying to rebuild his life after 8 months of systematic psychological torture. I was kept underground for 8 months, Thomas revealed during a carefully arranged meeting in a secure location. They said I was being cured of behavioral problems that were embarrassing my family. Daily injections, electric shock treatments, sensory deprivation, isolation. They were trying to break my mind and rebuild it according to their specifications. Thomas described a sophisticated program of psychological conditioning that combined physical torture with advanced brainwashing techniques. Children were systematically broken down through isolation, fear, and pain, then rebuilt as compliant subjects who would never question authority or reveal what had been done to them. Thomas continued, "The worst part wasn't the physical abuse. It was the psychological manipulation. They convinced us that our families had abandoned us, that we were defective and needed to be fixed. They made us grateful for the abuse, because it was supposedly making us better people. Thomas had escaped during a fire drill when security protocols were temporarily relaxed, but his family had been told he died in an accident. He had lived under an assumed identity for decades, too traumatized to reveal the truth and too afraid that the network would find him again. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who had taught at Blackwood Academy from 1985 to 1995, finally broke her decades of silence after seeing Jessica's investigation. Her testimony provided crucial medical evidence about the systematic abuse that had occurred at the school. "I reported suspected abuse to the headmaster in 1986, Dr. Warren confessed. I was told the children were delusional and needed psychiatric medication to control their fantasies. When I persisted in asking questions, I was dismissed for unprofessional conduct and threatened with criminal prosecution if I ever spoke about what I had seen." Dr. Warren revealed that Blackwood Academy had operated an unofficial medical program that administered experimental drugs to students without parental consent or proper medical supervision. Children who showed signs of resistance or trauma were heavily medicated to ensure their compliance and silence. The medical program was overseen by Dr. Marcus Pemberton, a psychiatrist who had connections to government research programs involving mind control and psychological conditioning. Pemberton's treatments were designed not to heal trauma, but to ensure that victims could never effectively communicate what had been done to them. Using ground-penetrating radar, Jessica's team confirmed the existence of the underground facility that David and Thomas had described. The basement complex beneath Blackwood Academy was far more extensive than original architectural plans had indicated, with multiple levels and sophisticated life support systems. Recent construction records showed that the basement entrances had been sealed with concrete in 1995, shortly after increased scrutiny following several high-profile missing children cases. But David revealed that secret access points still existed, allowing the facility to continue operating even after its official closure. "They moved the most sensitive operations deeper underground," David explained. "The sealed areas were just the public levels. The real facility goes down 5 stories and connects to tunnels that lead to other buildings on the estate." The discovery of the underground facility provided physical evidence that corroborated the testimonies of survivors and the photographic evidence in Fletcher's package. But accessing the facility would require a coordinated law enforcement operation that powerful forces were determined to prevent. David's most shocking revelation was that children were currently being held in the underground facility and other locations within the network. Real-time GPS data from hidden tracking devices showed 23 children who were supposedly receiving treatment at various facilities, but whose actual locations corresponded to underground installations. "Some of these children have been missing for over a decade," David revealed. "Their families think they're receiving therapy, but they're actually subjects in ongoing psychological experiments. The network has perfected techniques for creating completely controllable human beings." The realization that children were still being victimized transformed Jessica's historical investigation into an urgent rescue mission. But powerful forces within the British government and legal system were mobilizing to stop her before she could expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Time was running out for the children still trapped in the network, and Jessica faced a choice between her own safety and the lives of dozens of victims who had no one else to save them. Within hours of Jessica's midnight meeting with David, the forces protecting Blackwood Academy's secrets launched a coordinated campaign to silence her investigation. Death threats arrived at her office and home, warning her to stop investigating or join the missing children. The threats weren't empty intimidation. Jessica's office was broken into, her computers stolen, and her research files destroyed. Security cameras captured no footage of the break-in, suggesting professional involvement with advanced technical capabilities. Most ominously, Margaret Hartwell's home was vandalized with a message spray-painted across her front door. "Forget or follow your sons." The 73-year-old woman, already fragile from decades of grief and stress, was hospitalized with severe anxiety attacks after finding the threatening message. David Morrison, the maintenance worker who had provided crucial inside information, disappeared completely. His apartment was found empty, with signs of a hasty departure but no indication of where he had gone. Colleagues at Blackwood Academy were told he had suffered a family emergency and would not be returning to work. Blackwood Academy's response escalated beyond intimidation to sophisticated legal warfare designed to destroy Jessica's investigation through the courts. The school's lawyers obtained emergency injunctions, preventing her from approaching the school property or contacting current staff members. More seriously, the British government invoked national security provisions to classify Jessica's investigation as a threat to state interests. Official documents relating to elite schools were suddenly reclassified, and Jessica was warned that continuing her research could result in prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. The legal assault extended to the families of missing children who were threatened with prosecution for harassment if they continued speaking publicly about their experiences. Several families, already bankrupted by decades of fruitless searching, were forced to sign new non-disclosure agreements in exchange for modest financial settlements. Despite the attempts at suppression, Jessica's investigation had attracted the attention of international human rights organizations and foreign journalists beyond the reach of British legal intimidation. Leaked documents began revealing the extent of government involvement in covering up the abuse network. Cabinet-level ministers had been aware of the programs since the 1970s, but chose to protect them rather than expose elite institutions to scandal. Diplomatic cables showed that British officials had actively blocked international investigations and pressured foreign governments to ignore evidence of cross-border child trafficking. Detective Chief Inspector James Morrison, now retired, finally broke his silence about police complicity in the cover-up. We were ordered to classify missing children reports as runaways or family matters, he revealed. Any officer who pushed for real investigation was transferred or demoted. The protection came from the very top of government. The judicial system was equally compromised, with 3 High Court judges serving on Blackwood's Board of Governors and having direct financial interests in protecting the school's reputation. Court records showed systematic dismissal of abuse allegations against elite schools, often without proper investigation. As evidence of the conspiracy spread beyond Britain's borders, international pressure began mounting on the British government to allow a proper investigation. The European Court of Human Rights agreed to hear emergency petitions from families of missing children, and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Children's Rights announced a formal inquiry. American and European intelligence agencies, having reviewed evidence of the international child trafficking network, began pressuring British authorities to cooperate with multinational investigations. The diplomatic consequences of continued cover-up were becoming more serious than the scandal of exposure. Swiss authorities, responding to evidence that British children were being held in facilities within their territory, threatened to conduct unilateral rescue operations if the British government didn't act. Similar pressure came from Irish and French officials, who had discovered illegal facilities operating within their borders. The crisis brought together families who had been isolated by decades of official denial and legal intimidation. Led by Margaret Hartwell, whose determination had never wavered despite 36 years of disappointment, the families formed a unified coalition demanding justice. Emma Hartwell, Margaret's daughter who had spent years estranged from her family due to their obsession with her missing brothers, finally joined her mother's cause. "I spent 30 years angry at Mum for not letting go," Emma said. "Now I understand. She never let go because they're still alive somewhere." The coalition of families provided mutual support and shared resources for legal challenges that individual families couldn't afford. Their unified voice attracted media attention that was harder for authorities to suppress, and their combined evidence presented a pattern of abuse that was impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents. Thomas, the escaped victim who had provided crucial testimony about conditions in the underground facility, helped Jessica contact other survivors who had remained hidden for decades. Together, they formed a network of witnesses whose collective testimony provided overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse. "We survived so we could speak for those who couldn't escape," Thomas declared, as the survivors prepared to go public despite risks to their safety. Their willingness to reveal their identities and experiences provided the moral authority that transformed Jessica's investigation from academic research into a movement for justice. The survivors' detailed descriptions of the underground facility, the psychological conditioning techniques, and the network's operations provided law enforcement with actionable intelligence for potential rescue operations. But time was running out, as evidence suggested the network was preparing to relocate all current victims beyond the reach of British authorities. Jessica's investigation had attracted support from activists and organizations around the world, who recognized that the British network was part of a larger pattern of elite-protected child abuse. International coalitions formed to pressure governments into cooperation and coordinate rescue efforts across multiple countries. Europol, the FBI, and Interpol began sharing intelligence about facilities and personnel connected to the network, building cases that could be prosecuted, even if British authorities continued their obstruction. The international scope of the conspiracy had become its weakness, as foreign governments proved more willing to act than British officials. As international pressure mounted and evidence of ongoing crimes became undeniable, the British government faced an impossible choice. Continued protection of the network risked complete diplomatic isolation and potential military intervention by allied nations to rescue their citizens' children. The Prime Minister's office delivered a final ultimatum to Jessica: cease all investigation activities in exchange for a government commitment to review historical cases of missing children. The offer included financial compensation for affected families but required absolute silence about ongoing crimes. Margaret Hartwell's response spoke for all the families. "No amount of money brings back stolen children. We want the truth, we want our children back, and we want justice for 36 years of lies." The confrontation had reached its breaking point, with international rescue operations planned to begin at dawn, regardless of British government cooperation. At dawn, on September 15, 2020, exactly 36 years after the Hartwell brothers' disappearance, the largest international child rescue operation in European history began. Coordinated raids on 6 facilities across 4 countries represented unprecedented cooperation between law enforcement agencies determined to dismantle the elite abuse network. The primary target was Blackwood Academy itself, where ground-penetrating radar had confirmed the existence of extensive underground facilities housing current victims. British special forces, working under international warrants that overrode domestic legal obstacles, used advanced tunneling equipment to breach the sealed entrances to the basement complex. What they found exceeded even the worst fears of investigators who had spent years documenting the network's crimes. The underground facility contained 5 levels of sophisticated imprisonment and conditioning equipment, with 23 children currently being held in various stages of psychological experimentation. In the deepest level of the Swiss facility, investigators made the discovery that justified 36 years of searching. James and Michael Hartwell were alive. Now, 48 and 46 years old respectively, the brothers had survived decades of psychological conditioning that had transformed them into different people while preserving their essential humanity. James was found in a specialized medical unit where his psychological conditioning was being maintained through regular drug treatments and isolation protocols. Despite the sophisticated attempts to erase his identity, he retained fragmented memories of his childhood and family, though he struggled to integrate these memories with his conditioned responses. Michael was discovered in an artistic therapy program where his natural talents had been exploited to create propaganda materials for the network. His drawings and paintings, created under psychological duress, documented the facility's operations and provided crucial evidence of the systematic abuse inflicted on hundreds of children over decades. Both brothers required immediate medical attention for the effects of long-term psychological conditioning, malnutrition, and the various experimental procedures they had endured. Medical examinations revealed evidence of surgical modifications designed to enhance psychological control, including implanted devices that could influence brain chemistry and behavior. The coordinated raids yielded overwhelming evidence of the network's operations, including detailed records of 847 children who had been processed through various facilities since 1960. Computer databases contained precise documentation of psychological conditioning techniques, medical experiments, and the placement of conditioned subjects with wealthy families who paid premium prices for completely obedient servants. Financial records revealed the staggering scope of the criminal enterprise. Over £500 million in revenue from families seeking to dispose of unwanted children, government contracts for experimental research, and payments from wealthy individuals purchasing conditioned subjects for various purposes. The evidence led to the arrest of 156 individuals across 4 countries, including school administrators, medical personnel, government officials, and wealthy clients who had participated in the network's operations. The international scope of the prosecutions ensured that no jurisdiction could protect participants through local influence or corruption. Margaret Hartwell's first meeting with her sons after 36 years was both joyful and heartbreaking. The children she had lost were now middle-aged men who bore little resemblance to the boys who had vanished from their dormitory in 1984. Decades of psychological conditioning had changed their personalities, memories, and even their physical appearance through various medical procedures. "I have my boys back," Margaret said through tears. "But they're not the children I lost. They're survivors of something unimaginable, and I'll spend whatever time I have left helping them heal." The reunion was complicated by the brothers' psychological conditioning, which had trained them to suppress emotional responses and maintain distance from family attachments. Years of therapeutic intervention would be required to help them reconnect with their original identities while integrating the experiences that had shaped their adult lives. Emma Hartwell, the sister who had estranged herself from the family search for decades, became the primary coordinator of her brother's recovery. Her background in social work and her emotional distance from the trauma made her uniquely qualified to help navigate the complex process of reintegration. Dr. Patricia Williams, leading international expert in psychological conditioning recovery, developed specialized treatment protocols specifically for the Blackwood survivors. The challenge was unprecedented, helping individuals who had spent more of their lives under psychological control than in natural development. These individuals have undergone systematic psychological reconditioning designed to erase their original identities, Dr. Williams explained. The level of sophistication suggests decades of research and development. We're essentially helping them rediscover who they were before their trauma while accepting who they've become since. James showed remarkable progress in recovering memories of his childhood and his protective relationship with Michael. His breakthrough moment came when he looked at a family photograph and whispered, "Michael, I remember protecting you." The recognition of his brother triggered a cascade of recovered memories and emotions. Michael's recovery followed a different path, expressing his restored memories and emotions through artwork that documented both his trauma and his healing process. His drawings became therapeutic tools that helped other survivors process their own experiences while providing valuable evidence for ongoing prosecutions. The International Criminal Court's prosecution of the Blackwood Network established precedents for addressing institutional child abuse on a global scale. 47 individuals received sentences ranging from 15 years to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity, child trafficking, and systematic torture. The financial penalties were equally significant, with courts ordering the seizure of assets totaling over £2 billion for victim compensation and support services. The Blackwood Academy property was transferred to a foundation dedicated to supporting survivors of institutional abuse. Most importantly, the prosecution sent a clear message that wealth, privilege, and government connections could not protect individuals or institutions that systematically abused children. The international cooperation required to dismantle the network demonstrated that some crimes transcend national boundaries and require global justice. The exposure of the Blackwood Network triggered comprehensive legislative reforms across multiple countries. The International Convention on Elite School Oversight was ratified by 23 nations, establishing mandatory reporting requirements for missing students and independent inspection authorities for private educational institutions. New laws specifically addressed institutional child trafficking, closing legal loopholes that had allowed the network to operate across borders. Enhanced penalties for officials who covered up abuse ensured that future conspiracies would face severe consequences at every level of complicity. A victim compensation fund totaling £2 billion was established through asset seizures and government contributions, providing lifelong support for survivors and their families. The fund also supported research into recovery techniques for victims of systematic psychological conditioning. The final analysis of recovered documents from the Blackwood Network revealed the true scope and purpose of Program Phoenix, the code name for the systematic psychological conditioning operation. What investigators discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of elite education and social control. Program Phoenix had been designed not just to dispose of unwanted children, but to create a supply of perfectly conditioned servants for wealthy families and government agencies. The psychological techniques developed through decades of experimentation on children had been adapted for use in corporate training, political conditioning, and intelligence operations. The children weren't just victims, explained Dr. Williams during her final analysis. They were test subjects for developing techniques of psychological control that were then applied to entire populations. The network was conducting research into mass social conditioning using the most vulnerable subjects possible. The implications were staggering. Techniques developed through the torture of children at Blackwood Academy had been refined and implemented in corporate training programs, political campaigns, and social media manipulation systems that affected millions of people worldwide. 2 years after their rescue, James and Michael Hartwell had made remarkable progress in integrating their recovered memories with their conditioned experiences. Their breakthrough came during a family therapy session when they were able to discuss their shared experiences and support each other's healing. "We survived because we never forgot we were brothers," James said during their first public interview. "Even when they tried to erase our memories and identities, something inside us remembered that we belonged to each other and to our family." Michael's artistic expression had evolved from documenting trauma to celebrating recovery and resilience. His exhibitions of recovery artwork raised both awareness and funds for other survivors, while demonstrating the possibility of healing even from the most severe psychological damage. The brothers' decision to marry and start families represented the ultimate triumph over their conditioning. Their children would grow up knowing the full truth about their father's experiences, while being raised with the love and security that had been stolen from their parents. Margaret Hartwell lived to see her sons married and to hold her first grandchild before passing away peacefully at age 75. Her 36-year search for her children had not only brought them home, but had exposed a conspiracy that threatened children worldwide. Her final words, spoken to her sons during her last conscious moments, became a rallying cry for child protection advocates. "I never stopped believing you were alive because a mother's love doesn't die. Now that you're free, make sure no other children suffer what you suffered." The Margaret Hartwell Foundation for Missing Children, established with compensation funds and donations from around the world, became the leading international organization dedicated to finding missing children and supporting their families. The foundation's work led to the rescue of hundreds of additional children and the exposure of similar abuse networks in other countries. The Blackwood investigation triggered a worldwide examination of elite educational institutions and their treatment of vulnerable students. Similar networks were discovered and dismantled in 12 countries, leading to the rescue of over 800 children and the prosecution of thousands of individuals involved in systematic abuse. The case established new international protocols for investigating institutional abuse and created permanent monitoring systems to prevent the emergence of similar networks. The cooperation required to dismantle the Blackwood conspiracy became a model for addressing transnational crimes against children. Educational reforms implemented in response to the scandal transformed the oversight of private schools worldwide. Mandatory reporting systems, independent inspections, and international databases tracking student transfers made it virtually impossible for similar operations to develop in the future. The Hartwell brothers' story revealed fundamental truths about the nature of institutional power and the vulnerability of children in elite educational settings. It demonstrated how wealth and privilege could be used to systematically abuse the most vulnerable members of society while maintaining public facades of respectability and excellence. The case proved that persistent advocacy by families could overcome even the most sophisticated cover-ups when supported by international cooperation and moral courage. Margaret Hartwell's refusal to accept official explanations inspired other families to continue searching for missing children and demanding accountability from institutions. Most importantly, the story showed that human resilience could triumph over even the most systematic attempts to destroy identity and family bonds. James and Michael's survival and recovery proved that love, determination, and therapeutic support could help victims reclaim their lives, even after decades of abuse. The Blackwood case offers crucial lessons for parents, educators, and policymakers about protecting children in institutional settings. It demonstrates the importance of questioning authority when children's welfare is at stake and maintaining oversight of institutions that serve vulnerable populations. For families dealing with missing children, the Hartwell story provides hope that persistence and international cooperation can achieve justice even in seemingly impossible circumstances. It shows that no institution is too powerful to be held accountable when communities unite to demand the truth. The case also highlights the importance of supporting survivors of institutional abuse and providing specialized treatment for victims of systematic psychological conditioning. Recovery is possible, but it requires understanding, patience, and resources that society must commit to providing. While the Blackwood Network has been dismantled, the case serves as a reminder that vigilance is essential to prevent similar operations from developing. The techniques of psychological conditioning continue to evolve, and new technologies create both opportunities for abuse and tools for prevention. International monitoring systems, established in response to the Blackwood case, continue to identify and investigate suspicious patterns at educational institutions worldwide. The legal precedents set by the prosecutions provide frameworks for addressing future cases of institutional abuse. Educational programs teaching children about their rights and how to report abuse help create the awareness necessary to prevent future victimization. Training for educators, parents, and officials helps identify warning signs of institutional abuse before it can become systematic. The story of James and Michael Hartwell proves that no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against truth and justice, determined families and communities can overcome institutional corruption and bring children home. Their 36-year journey from victims to survivors to advocates demonstrates the power of love to transcend even the most sophisticated attempts at psychological control. Margaret Hartwell's unwavering belief that her sons were alive somewhere despite decades of official denial and social pressure to move on, saved not only James and Michael, but hundreds of other children trapped in the network. Her legacy reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to accept unacceptable explanations. Jessica Morgan's investigation, supported by brave survivors and international allies, proved that truth can prevail over power when people unite for justice. The cooperation required to expose and dismantle the Blackwood Network demonstrates that protecting children is a responsibility that transcends national boundaries and institutional loyalties. The Hartwell brothers' recovery and their decision to build families of their own represents the ultimate victory over those who tried to destroy their humanity. Their children will grow up free because their parents refused to surrender to despair, and their story will inspire future generations to fight for justice, no matter how impossible the odds seem. In our interconnected world, no child should disappear into institutional silence. No family should search alone for missing loved ones. And no conspiracy should be too powerful to face justice. The Hartwell case proves that when we unite across borders and institutions to protect children, we can achieve what seems impossible and ensure that love ultimately triumphs over evil.